All right. Welcome, everybody, to tonight's live stream. My name is Cyrus Janssen. I want to welcome you to this evening's show because this is a very important time to be talking about geopolitics. And I'm very honored to be joined by a great panel tonight. We're going to have an amazing discussion. There are so many things that are going on in our world today. And I'm going to get our back screen here launched. And we've got some incredible guests. We're going to go ahead and bring them into the show here. So again, this is Geopolitics Live, and I'm joined by Mitch Presnick here on the my, let's see, this would be my left or the top right of the screen there for you folks at home. Mitch, tremendous amount of time in China, great experience. Mitch, welcome back to the show.
Good to see you, Cyrus.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got Arnaud as well in the bottom right corner of your screen, everybody. Arnaud is one of the best geopolitical commentators on Twitter. Fantastic insights. One of just recently launched a Substack that is doing fantastic. I think number 4 best new up and coming Substack. I believe it's what it's called, the ranking. So Arnaud, how are you tonight?
I'm great. Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, fantastic. And of course, we've got Zichen. Zichen, you've got another fantastic Substack. I think, another great insider, and we're very excited to discuss many important topics tonight, but of course, the main topic that we're going to go around and we're going to start off this discussion is going to be on Iran and Israel. Obviously, we're in day 7 of this intense war. And I think a big question that's going around right now in social media is, what is China going to do about this, right? We know that most likely the United States, it looks very imminent that the United States is going to be entering into this war. On all accounts, we already know that the United States certainly is supporting Israel, certainly morally and financially and certainly militarily. Will the United States enter into the war? It seems very likely at this point, but a lot of people are looking at China. Obviously, China has a close relationship with Iran. But we're going to start out discussion off there. So, gentlemen, let's talk a little bit about this new pending war that we've seen going on. And Mitch, why don't you open us up on your initial thoughts on everything that's going on right now?
Good to see you. Good to see you guys, Zichen, Arnaud. Obviously China is not going to get involved. It would be crazy to get involved. Not just because they have actually principles around the idea of non-involvement in others' internal affairs, and it's worked really well for them, and that goes back decades. But also, there's no margin for them to do this, right? The best thing that could happen to them is for the U.S. to get involved and start to get bogged down in yet another expensive and ultimately, difficult to get out of Middle East conflict. That's unlikely that China would follow that. In fact, just for the fact that the U.S. might do it, China's going to do the opposite, obviously. And then it remains to be seen whether Trump can avoid the trap that's pulled in every single president. We talk about Vietnam being a quagmire, right? Starting with Kennedy and then going all the way to LBJ and then Nixon. This is like a far more, I don't think people realize it. 10 Belt and Roads, that's what we spent in Afghanistan, right? 10 Belt and Roads, not including Iraq 1 and Iraq 2. From a financial standpoint, the U.S. can't even really afford this at this point. Like, already we're dealing with a deficit that is 6 to 7% of GDP. That's at least double what it should be. And, now you add in another Middle East conflict because it's not going to be quick. Look at how resilient Iran was in the Iran-Iraq war. And Iraq was a far better munitioned adversary than Iran. And yet somehow Iran, with its 90 million people, they've got a lot of guts there. People forget that they are the Persian Empire in modern form, right? Because we're looking at now a Muslim regime, but ultimately these guys had serious game. They were one of the great empires of history, and they still have that collective memory in a way, sort of like China. In fact, I don't know if I completely agree with this, but there are many that believe that the Persian Empire, or that Iran, is the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, right? That's China's number 2. I tend to think that China is number 1 because of the fact that it has the longest written history, the longest, longest continuous language and all of that. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said for what they've got over there, and I sincerely hope the U.S. stays out of it.
I couldn't agree more. Arnaud, I want to go to you because I mentioned earlier that you have launched your Substack, a huge fan of your work. And, I think all of us really enjoy your insights on Twitter. Your writing is phenomenal. But you had a couple of articles this week that really hit on this topic. I want to give you the platform to really showcase that and kind of share your theory and your thoughts on this. Very interesting. I wanted you to share that with everybody.
Sure. So I think there are a couple of ways to see that. One way is the realist perspective. Basically, what Mitch was explaining. Like there is this running joke in China that whenever the US finally gets ready to pivot to China, someone in the Middle East saves them. So it's kind of that. One article I wrote is a commentary on a video, more like a panel, in which there was a lady called Oriana Skylar Mastro, who is used to be during 14 years one of the top China analysts in the Pentagon, and she's very, very smart. Now she's a professor at Stanford. She really knows her stuff, and basically what she was explaining is that it's a major mistake. It will be a major mistake for the US to get involved in Iran because it's just wasted resources and focus from the US point of view. What they should be doing is pivot to China, and this just defocuses them from that. So from China's standpoint, just for that, from a realist perspective, it's a good news. But then there is another perspective, which I think is even more interesting, and which is why I push back against so many people saying that China should get involved. First of all, it's crazy to say that for the very reason that China has had a winning formula for 30 years, which is focus on itself, on its own development, on its own people, and don't spend money on military interventions abroad. And the US has had arguably a losing formula, which is the exact opposite. Focus on military interventions abroad instead of focusing on improving themselves. So why would China adopt the losing strategy, give up its winning strategy and adopt the losing strategy? But also I think that China is trying to put in place a new world order, which is based on key principles. One key principle is non-interference in other countries' internal affairs. That's one thing. Another key principle is an end to bloc politics. So the end of, like, they don't want like a Cold War situation where you have blocs competing with each other. And them intervening in Iran will go against all those principles. And it will completely violate the value of China in the eyes of much of the world. The value of China, and the key reason why it's rising, is because it represents hope for a new world. So if it starts acting like the US, of course, on the other side, then it's just a new US, but on the other side. So you loses that hope, you loses all value, and then what is the point of China bringing a new world order if it's not actually going to be a new world order? It's going to be just the same. So that I think is a very important point from China's standpoint. And the last point I wanted to mention is that I don't even think that China intervening will be in Iran's interest, or Palestinians, for instance, if because many people said that they should intervene for Palestinians as well. Imagine, for instance, that China starts to intervene in favor of Palestinians. Then immediately what that does is that it transforms the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian conflict, into a US-China proxy war Is that good for Palestinians? I don't think so. In proxy wars, the ones who suffer the most are always the proxies. So for all those reasons, I think it would be completely foolish for China to do anything, and to intervene, and I don't think they will.
No, I think it's a good point. So I think two very strong opening statements there from Mitch and Arnaud, given the history. And Arnaud, I think you hit it on the head there. China has had a winning strategy for many decades. Obviously, we've seen the rise of China this past 4 decades. We've seen the Belt and Road Initiative has been a tremendous success. Mitch, I mean, that's incredible when you pointed out the U.S. spent 10 Belt and Road equivalents on this last war in the Middle East. Of course, let's not forget that was to replace the Taliban with the Taliban, right? I mean, it was a complete and utter failure for the U.S. military. Zichen, I want to pass it over to you. I want to get a little bit more from the Chinese perspective on, maybe not. I think we've established the fact it's very unlikely. It's very unlikely for China to get involved, just as it's very likely for the U.S. to get involved. But I want you to get your thought. What's the Chinese perspective on this new conflict that's arose in the Middle East, and how this is going to affect, the world order and, the many other events going on right now throughout the world, Russia, Ukraine. I mean, obviously the continuing genocide in Gaza, rising tensions in Asia as well. Let me know your perspective as a Chinese and kind of the Chinese perspective on this new conflict and what it means for the world.
Cyrus, Mitch, and Arnaud, happy to be here again. Actually, just I think 1 or 2 hours before the starts, we have a press readout from Beijing, where President Xi Jinping actually had a phone call with President Vladimir Putin, and their entire conversation, based on the Chinese press readout, is about the war between Iran and Israel. And I think what President Xi said is quite consistent from what the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said a few days ago. I think Wang Yi, as China's top diplomat, has also been very busy phoning, his Israeli counterpart, his Iranian counterpart, and also his counterparts in the Gulf. And the Chinese message, to put it simply, is to call for a ceasefire. And I think Xi Jinping made 4 points in his press readouts in the phone call with President Putin. Basically, I think this is what all of you have just summarized so far and perfectly, is that, basically war is not the way to resolve international conflicts. It only escalates hatred and especially with Israel and Iran, and Israel may probably there is no objective, I think, evidence, but everyone suspects it has nuclear weapons, and already it's a region where without peace in the Middle East, there is no peace in the world, and past decades have spoken to that. With one unfortunate crisis after another, and the Chinese are calling for dialogues and the negotiations, and for political solutions to not just this ongoing war, but also the backdrop of the recent conflict is the Iran nuclear issue. There was actually already a political solution. There was before President Trump tore up the Iran nuclear deal, there was China, there was Europeans, there was Americans, there was a political solution to the Iranian nuclear issue, and it's just unfortunately Israel has resorted to bombing Iran, and including targeted attacks on nuclear facilities, which is against international law, and that's the factor alone. Attacks on nuclear facilities is of course very dangerous, but that attack is against international law, and Israel bills this attack as preemptive attack, and but there is no exemption for preemptive attack in UN Charter or anything. So I think the Chinese stance is calling for dialogues, for a ceasefire, and also puts the more pressure, let's say, on the Israeli side. And it's also, one of the biggest topics on Chinese social media for the past week, as the subject is on Twitter and elsewhere. And there are a lot of domestic discussions based on the discourse that I have come across. I think the prevailing view is that Iran is not doing very well so far in the military conflict, and Israel is having a upper hand, which is, I guess, part of the reason that we are seeing, the U.S. seems to be ready to double down on a what they perhaps see as some sort of wing, a consolidation of the upper hand at this moment. And this is really a big crisis. And I agree totally with Mitch, with Arnaud just now. From the U.S. national interest perspective, just spending a huge amount of money, causing, escalating a further war. And particularly, as Mitch has elaborated, Iran is a huge country. It's a big player in the Middle East. It's, yes, it has its domestic problems. And, the progress so far on the background seems to reveal significant challenges that Iran faces militarily and domestically, which, well, may be a little bit surprising, but that's actually one of the key discussion points on Chinese social media, with many opinion leaders, lamenting or criticizing the deficiencies so far revealed on the Iranian side. And I'm very sure nobody in China is talking about, somehow putting China into this war, sending arms or troops to Iran and, setting up a proxy war. There is definitely no talk of that. I see no possibility for that to happen as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think, gentlemen, everybody said a very good analysis, I think, of this situation. And I think more from, the U.S. perspective, I think, Mitch and I, as U.S. citizens, we have a lot of experience with this. We've seen our government and how we've acted, and we know that the Israeli lobby commands a tremendous amount of power inside the U.S. government. I think it's really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Israel to do this attack against Iran. It's no secret that Netanyahu has been wanting to escalate and really attack Iran for quite some time. There's been a very famous clip that's been shown on social media. I believe it was CNN that had a nice compilation of all of these clips from Netanyahu starting back in 1995, warning about the threat of Iran having nuclear weapons. And so this has literally been going on for 30 straight years, that, Iran is weeks away. It's a month away. It's 2 months away. And it almost reminded me of the Gordon Chang analogy, where it's like, 2001, the coming collapse of China, and then have to update that book every 2 to 3 years. And, here we are, 25 years later. And it's like, well, guess what, guys, the collapse of China is still coming. Just kind of hold on and wait for me. And I think given this, the other thing was really interesting. I'll share an insight. I did have a chance to interview Professor Glenn Deason from Norway, a great insider. He's predominantly known for being a very rational voice on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And he had shared something, I think, that was very insightful. He said, too often in the West, we get into these bubbles. For example, do you support Russia or do you support Ukraine? You can only be on one side. And so now it's, gone to, do you support, Israel or do you support Iran? And he said, it's not really, an A or B answer. It's more, do you support a peaceful negotiation and a pathway to peace, or are you supporting war? That's more the thing. I don't think that any of us on this panel would say, hey, we're all about Iran. Like, let's go Iran. Let's, we're all flying Iranian flags and we're somehow behind them. It's just more, I think there's a peaceful solution. Like Zichen had said, Donald Trump had the peace, the treaty. He drafted that. That was in play. Of course, that was then torn up and rejected. So it's going to be very interesting to see. So I think, very, very interesting times ahead. I think this is certainly what I wanted to lead off the show tonight, was talking about Israel-Iran. But, gentlemen, going on behind the scenes, I think there's been a lot of other things going on. I'm just going to briefly introduce these topics. We can jump into all of these but I think it's very important. We've had a couple. Earlier last week we had an incredible movement from the continent of Africa. 53 of the 54 countries actually pledged an allegiance towards China. They had this huge. It was the China-Africa Changsha Declaration. This is quite amazing. Also, we're going to be talking a little bit about. I want to talk about the London deal. We can talk a little bit about this between U.S. and China. Basically, a framework was certainly agreed to. And then also breaking news earlier this week. Again, a lot of these stories aren't being covered right now because of the conflict in the Middle East. But I think AUKUS, which had so much momentum at one point, and it really was such a big deal. Now rumors that this could potentially be off the table. Mitch, why don't you start us off on this next round? Pick one of those three topics. Which one would you like to talk about next, and kind of get your thoughts on?
I mean, I'll, before we get off, I'll just mention one more thing on the Iran Israel conflict. I mean, there is one difference between this time and every other time. The world was not multipolar for all the previous conflicts, right? We were still skating on the ether remains of the momentum created by the collapse of the USSR, and so it is interesting to see just how China, and now in two major world conflicts, has actually played a much more important role. Even its silence is important. Like, even when it doesn't do anything, just the fact that it's there changes the calculus. And I just think that's an interesting point to mention. Yeah, I mean, what I'm focused on mostly, of course, is U.S.-China and the London agreement. People say that the entire trade and tariff discussion, war, whatever you want to call it, between the U.S. and China was a waste of time. I don't think so, because people are assuming that people in Washington, the leaders in Washington, understand objective reality, which is that actually China doesn't need the U.S. more than the U.S. needs China, and China does have levers. Remember, during Trump 1.0, there was a belief in Washington that China couldn't hurt the U.S. because China in 1.0 had a policy of reciprocity, which was, if whatever the U.S. does to us, we're going to take a measured response because we don't want to hurt the American heartland where we have a lot of support, for agriculture. We don't want to hurt, the Fortune 500 or Wall Street, because that's where we've got our support and people that are more reasonable about U.S.-China relations. So they had the rationale of reciprocity. This time, it's obvious the strategy has shifted to asymmetry, right? Where if you hurt us, we're going to hurt you 10 times worse. And by the way, we know just where the pressure points are, right? So now these guys are like Shaolin masters now, like going right after it, rare earths and treasury bills and all the real pain points for the U.S. So I think that it was not a wasted effort, if nothing else, to show people in Washington that no, actually, it's because I thought when I came, for example, when I came to Cambridge, I thought I was going to be spending 90% of my time trying to introduce the argument that strategic leveraging of China's strengths was a superior strategy for the U.S. than decoupling. Pretty simple. But actually, I hardly ever got a chance to talk about. I mean, now I'm getting to talk about it quite a bit, and now the conversation has come to include that idea, which I'm pretty sure I created it. I don't know if I created it. I don't want to take more credit than I deserve, but nobody else was talking about it. And now everyone's talking about this idea. So hopefully I had a role to play at least. But the fact of the matter is, I spent 90% of my time just trying to get everyone to agree on what reality was, which was rare. I mentioned in my Harvard Business Review article in August last year that China controlled rare earths, and that was a massive pressure point that they could use whenever they wanted to on the U.S. And when I talked to my friends in Washington about it, they were like, yeah, maybe, I don't know. Yeah. Like, guys, you don't understand, like, defense material, hello, like, whatever you think it is, it's 100 times more serious. But in that bubble within the beltway of Washington, D.C., it did not seem serious until China actually did it. And now everyone goes, oh, geez, like, okay, that's real. Now we got to figure out, well, how do we fix this? And, I tweeted something earlier this week that, the best time to plant a tree, according to the Chinese idiom, is 20 years ago. and the second best time is now. But I sure as hell wish we had just learned a little bit from the Chinese playbook 20 years ago when they were developing rare earth processing. Why do we have to actually go through this process? If the U.S. ever could learn something from China, I would hope and pray it would be long-term planning, balancing long-term strategy against short-term, goals. And second, industrial policy. Those two things alone, the U.S. could be in a very different position than it's in right now. And hopefully this will be the wake-up call for Washington to understand that point. I'm not terribly optimistic. I think they're barely accepting the idea that China actually has pressure points that can apply and actually use. They might be trying to rationalize it in Washington by saying that, well, that's just because the Chinese are great at negotiating. Who knows what they're saying, right, in Washington. But I do think that it's possible that in Washington they're still coming to terms with this reality. So those are my initial thoughts on London.
Yeah, I think, just to kind of piggyback on that, Mitch, I mean, it's interesting with the rare earths. I mean, for our viewers that are watching, actually rare earth minerals are not that rare. I mean, they're actually all over the world. China has a lot of them. Africa has tremendous amounts. I mean, actually, even in North America, there's a lot of these, but it's the refining that actually, and the processing of these metals that is quite incredible. I actually learned this just last week that even in the United States, we can process up to 99.95%. But in order to use these rare earths in the advanced industries like semiconductors, even some of the cancer research, it has to be purified to a 99.99% level. And that small, minuscule difference makes it usable or unusable, and that is, and China is really the only country in the world that can get to that level on a large basis, to be able to get to that 99.99%. And another fun fact was when you looked at the auto industry in the United States, everything from the windshield wipers and things. There's so many elements that actually needed these rare earths. It was quite fascinating that there were several U.S. automakers actually considering shifting part of their production to China in order to get access to these rare earths. So it was very much like Mitch, you had pointed out, this is very much a leverage point for China. They definitely had a pain point that they could immediately put on the U.S. economy. And then I think one of the things that came through at that London discussion was that there was a deal of around 98 contracts specifically for the auto industry that they're able to essentially keep their factories open. There was actually several U.S. auto manufacturers that were considering closing their doors short term if they were not able to get those materials from China. China did agree with that in London, but here's the kicker: is that they've only had a 6-month expiration on those. So after 6 months, they're going to be able to review that. They wanted to make sure that they still have some leverage just in case the United States, and this trade war, fires up again. Arnaud, what was your takeaway from London and this? I know it seems a little bit on the back burner now with our conflict in the Middle East, but where do you feel right now between the U.S. and China as we're looking at trade specifically, and what's the next step as this goes to the desks of Xi Jinping and Donald Trump?
Yes, so I tend to agree with Mitch in that China, while the US underestimated Chinese leverage and also overestimated their own leverage. One thing that I found interesting was the use of ethane sanctions against China as a response to rare earth, which to me shows quite a bit of despair by the US because ethane, I've read a fascinating analysis on this by CSIS, which I posted about. Ethane is nowhere near being an economic weapon for the US, the way rare earth is for China. It's something that is used in the production of plastic. But it's very easily switchable. So China can, if they don't get ethane, they get a lot of their ethane from the US. But if they don't get it, they can easily switch to another material called naphtha, and that's the end of it, right? And 45% of ethane production from the US goes to China. So China is a major customer for them. So why would they use that? Well, it's not that necessary for China, but it's quite necessary for them, because 45% of their exports going to China, right? China is a major customer. So it shows that their options are actually quite limited for them to be using something like that hurts them more than it hurts China. So I found that quite interesting. And where we end up is actually not a very good deal. I mean, if you think about it. So basically where we end up is we still have quite a high level of tariffs, around 50% in total, if I kept track, on everything that the US buys from China, which basically means that American consumers got stuck with a 50% tax. On the 50% tax is not going to revive American production. It's just a tax, I think. It's on due to the very volatile nature of this trade war. No businessman would be crazy enough to say, I'm going to invest durably into a new, a new plant of computers, for instance, that will be made in the US, because that tax level is on Chinese computers is going to stay forever. So it's just a tax that's not going to revive production in the US, I think. And meanwhile, what China has had to do is to basically, agreed to sell rare earths that it was already selling before. So China hasn't really, changed anything meaningful. Yeah, they've just removed a sanction that they put. So I don't think that from the point of view of the US, Trump really got anything out of it.
Yeah, it's hard. It's great insights as always, Arnaud, and I think it's it was a very vague meeting. I think from London. I mean, obviously the conclusion was that we've agreed to a framework. We were trying to sort out a deal. Obviously, China did let some amount of rare earths come in. I agree with you. I mean, the 50% tariffs is essentially what that is. So actually, that's still a very high rate. Again, U.S. consumers are paying for that. Again, a point that many people still don't understand. But Zichen, let's go to you. I'd like to get your thoughts on, from the Chinese perspective. What are you looking at, from this deal? Are you seeing this as a win for China, or are you seeing that, is China being more optimistic now? I guess the one good thing is we're not really talking about this anymore because of this conflict in the Middle East. It seems like we're, moved on to more important things. But what do you see for the future, Zichen, in regards to trade between the US and China?
So just piggyback to the ongoing war for a little bit, is that the US spends a lot of money, and including squanders a lot of precious, lives of its brave military service person, and comparatively, relatively, the US is basically spending its resources, not strengthening itself. And that could be seen as a win for China, relatively speaking, between the two countries. But I think in absolute terms, China really doesn't like the sort of, conflict, instability in the Middle East, even if it means the US is distracted, is spending huge sums of money on weapons and, on its military. Because, the Chinese want to develop its economy. That's its number one priority. China is the number one trader in goods, which desires, peaceful maritime trade. China is a huge energy importer, despite its, recent, basically huge growth in domestic energy supply in terms of green energy, but it still imports a lot of, oil and gas. So instability overseas in the Middle East or elsewhere, that's detrimental to Chinese interests. So the Chinese are not happily sitting there. See, these guys are starting another war. So I think the Beijing is not, hiding somewhere and having beers over some war in the Middle East. That's not what the Chinese feel, because this sort of conflict and instability is not in Chinese favor. And coming back to the trade talks between China and the U.S., I think one thing that Beijing did made a significant took a significant step forward is that Commerce Secretary Lutnick was involved in the talks, and he was there to talk about export control, which for Beijing is a net win, because in past negotiations, the U.S. standpoint has always been, export control, which is under the jurisdiction of the BIS, the Bureau of Industrial Security, which is part of the Commerce Department. The U.S. stance is this is our own national security stuff. It's unnegotiable. We can talk about tariffs. Maybe you'll buy a little bit more Boeing jet passengers, some more, other stuff. But export control, where the U.S. is just gonna add another, item, H20, H100, all these chips, and the different softwares. But Beijing stood firm, and Secretary Lutnick was in the talks, and China basically leveraged its own refining capacity in rare earths to get the U.S. to have to put U.S. export control on the table for the first time. So from the Chinese point of view, I think that is a significant step forward. And also, I hate to say this, but the U.S. has always been, in effect, a teacher for the People's Republic of China. Before the trade war started by the Trump administration, the Chinese doesn't have nearly a robust export control regime. The Chinese doesn't have its own, unreliable entity list. But since the trade war, the Chinese Commerce Ministry, I guess, the MOFCOM, which is known in China, have to put in a lot of extra hours and nights to establish these, new security-related mechanisms so that it can wield its power to somehow weaponize part of its comparative advantages to negotiate with the U.S. So yes, in that sense, the U.S. has been a teacher. But I would hope the U.S. could teach something more open, more benign to the Chinese, rather than how to securitize, how to weaponize its certain advantages. After the London talks, President Xi and President Trump also had a phone call, and I'm a little bit encouraged because these two leaders are the number one leader in each country with outside influence in its politics and its policy making. And they have promised, and this is according to the readouts of both countries, that they've openly said to one another and to the entire world that they will visit each other. So the President Trump will visit China sometime. The Chinese president will visit the U.S. sometime. Although the timing, the exact formality haven't been announced or even maybe formulated, but that these two, the biggest leaders of the world, will meet one another and have talks. I think that's also progress, and I think they are, in my personal view, are like the defense lines for the two countries' tensions to really get out of control. So that is a positive news for me.
Absolutely. Mitch, did you want to add anything in there? I know you kind of had some smiles. Yeah, I want to give you a platform just to let you say anything.
No. Just first of all, I think I was just laughing to myself. I was just wondering when someone in the U.S. is going to accuse China of IP theft over our export control regime. That was just a random thought. But the trade and tariff war of 2025 is happening within the context of, I believe, a much bigger shift. That's been happening for, well, I would argue since 2011 or 12. From the era of engagement to the era of decoupling to what I had always predicted would be a post-decoupling world. And I actually think that this tariff and trade conflict, it's a very necessary part of that process, and it does take us to a place, and it seems to be taking us to this place. I mean, we're not seeing, because it's not right up in our face, but it is taking us to a place where everybody is dealing with the other side more pragmatically, more dispassionately, with less ideology. And at least on the US side, that is a major evolution. And I don't think we should underestimate the importance of that. If this conflict, this conversation, this, whatever, I mean, forget about Trump and Xi meeting, forget about anything else. If just the fact that the US now understands that it doesn't have the ability to change China's regime when it wants to, if it really wanted to, or it doesn't have the ability to bring China to its knees economically if it wanted to, or once that is clearly digested in Washington, now we come to the place that Kissinger wanted us to come to in 1971. No love, no hate, just business, not based on trust, based on interests. And yeah, we're not going to deal with each other where we don't have to, but just on the things that the US and China have to deal with one another. That's an enormous amount of overlap in the Venn diagram just by itself. I mean, China is trying to make sure that it doesn't get caught in the middle income trap.
Right.
Whatever you want to say, it's easier to do that when the US and its allies in the developed world are at least not in open conflict with China over things, right? It can happen for China without any support from the developed world, or just the bare minimum, but it's so much easier for China to get over that middle income trap. And that's a real thing, by the way, the middle income trap. I mean, it could actually happen to China. So I think for China, it's a no-brainer if it can, without having to give up its agency, to work with the U.S. and where it can, in a very dispassionate, non-ideological way. I think that's a win for China. Obviously, for the U.S., we've now determined that there are things that the U.S. needs from China that it just simply can't do without. And now that conversation is happening, I can now dust off my HBR article and look at all the different things that the U.S. should be working with China on: reindustrialization, supply chain controls. May I even suggest technology transfer? Right? I mean, you talk about China learning from the U.S. Why can't the U.S. learn from China? And all of these opportunities are now opened up only because we've now gotten to everyone's bottom line, and even the hawks in Washington have to admit that China was willing to walk away. China was willing to say, nope, we're done. We're good. And that was not the case until very recently. So, I mean, I think it's hopefully moving towards this post-engagement, post-decoupling world that I kept talking about, because it would be great. And I'll mention one final thing, by the way, which is that
Sure.
Symbiotic relationships don't have to be voluntary, but they are still symbiotic. And the fact is, did anyone else notice in the Liang Hui that just took place a couple months ago, for the first time since she took office, private enterprise was number one. It was mentioned the most. It was highest priority. That's the first time ever. Would that have happened if it had been a Biden Part 2 type of U.S. government? I don't think so, because the U.S. government was focused on quads and whatever, and it wasn't really going after this kind of let's get down to the bare bones of negotiation. So in a weird way, I think that Trump is more likely to create a reset than any president we've had since Nixon. I would say that Trump is more likely to take China seriously as a peer competitor than any of the previous presidents have. And I don't think that would have happened if not for the symbiotic nature of this relationship. It's still symbiotic. Nobody likes to admit it, but it's there for everyone to see if you really look. So those are my thoughts.
Fantastic. Arnaud, I want to give you a chance. Do you want to add anything into this topic before we go to our next one?
Sure. I mean, I do agree with Mitch that it's part of a process. I kind of see it like the different stages of grief. You have those, 5 stages of grief?
Look at Jen.
Yeah.
That's funny.
I will be a bit less optimistic than Mitch is, because what we're saying is that the US needs to go to the acceptance stage right? And I don't think it's there yet. I think it's still going to take a while, unfortunately, probably a few years, because I still think that a lot of its actions they have in the back of their mind ultimately trying to, not even contain China, but pull China back in order for them to, retain their hegemony, like what we're seeing with Russia, for instance, and all the talk around getting back into a relationship with Russia and trying to do an inverse Sino-Soviet split, where Russia, or reverse Kissinger, I think the term is. They're really trying to do that. I don't think there is any hope that they will manage to do it. The thought is still there, right? So that's not acceptance. They're still trying, and I think they're still going to try for a while before they finally go to that acceptance stage.
Yeah, very good insights there. Zichen, I'll give you a final chance to respond to that and add any additional comments, and then we'll switch to our next topic.
Yeah, I think Mitch have made a perfect point. I think of course China has been standing firm, and based on the results from the 2 rounds of tariffs, 2 rounds of talks, first in Geneva and then in London, it's apparent that China was the only major economy that almost immediately retaliated against U.S. tariffs. I think the Chinese takeaway is, well, we stood firm and we didn't budge, and we fought the U.S. to somewhat to a standstill and back at the negotiating table. So that would actually encourage the Chinese to stand even firmer in the future, that it will not, drop down on its knees and beg Washington for some sort of compromise. And the rest of the world is also witnessing the development. And we see, for example, Japan, a key U.S. ally, has apparently turned down, the 10 percentage point basis tariff points. The Japanese Prime Minister met President Trump again in the G7 talks, and there was no apparent resolution of their differences. And so far, the U.S. hasn't netted any significant, trade concessions from the rest of its partners. And I think from the Chinese standpoint is, there was this famous video. I'm sure you all saw that. Don't kneel down, and just stick to its own strengths, and try to find the leverages that China can use against the United States. But of course, at the same time, the trade war, all these uncertainties are taking a toll on the Chinese economy, because as much as China has been trying to rebalance its economy and its exports, especially exports to the United States, still is quite significant for Chinese jobs, for Chinese manufacturing. So the Chinese want some sort of acceptable, middle ground compromise that the 2 countries will finally reach. But I guess it's again, as the rare earths actually export license is only valid for a number of days. So I think that's Chinese sticking to its leverage, and also be prepared for future uncertainties. Oh, just by the way, 20% of the about 50% tariffs that the U.S. now has on China is rationalized as some sort of punishment on Chinese non-cooperation on fentanyl. But just earlier today, the Chinese authorities in charge of anti-narcotics have further announced the scheduling, so basically banning some sort of narcotics. And so I think on that part, there is progress, and the two sides maybe moving towards some sort of collaboration, because fentanyl obviously has taken a huge toll in the U.S. Many people have tragically died. And for the Chinese, the problem is not the Chinese is actively exporting fentanyl. No, it is not. It's not export. It's not actively trying to murder U.S. citizens by giving precursors to fentanyl and ship them to Mexico. But because all these precursors they have other valid lawful uses in other industrial applications. So it's a process, and also scheduling all these, putting into place all these very stringent measures that has cost on the Chinese domestic economy and industry as well. But I'm happy to see there is further progress on that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think certainly everybody on this panel, I think, is very much pro-engagement and pro-dialogue and trying to find a way to work together. And I think there's two events I want to kind of talk about as one last topic for us this evening, because, again, what we're trying to do is bring some very rational and just kind of some insights into what's happening in our world right now. The world is just so complicated. It's interesting is that, again, these stories were not that prominent in Western media because, again, the focus has been on Israel, Iran. But again, we had this Changsha Declaration where we had 53 nations from Africa signed a deal with China, and it was quite amazing the details of this. I mean, there was basically tons of delegates from Africa came to China. They had talked everything from mining to solar panels to agriculture. An incredible amount of deals were signed. A lot of business was being done. Also, very interesting enough, Xi Jinping just did a trip to Kazakhstan and signed a new cooperation agreement with Central Asian countries, including Uzbekistan and several other nations in that region right on the Caspian Sea. So again, you kind of see this interesting scenario right now where we know China has built the Belt and Road, but you see them expanding their reach in the world and certainly increasing in popularity, increasing in the amount of deals that they're doing. Mitch, what do you feel about China's moves now with this Changsha delegation? 53 nations signing up for that, and then also Xi Jinping's first trip, since this Iran-Israel war started up. It's interesting enough, going to Kazakhstan, very close to that conflict, but obviously going to do a new business deal and sign a new cooperation with 5 new countries.
When I first arrived at Peking University in 1988, there was a professor who was retired, but he would come often to our students' cafeteria and have lunch with us. And he took a liking to me, and we would sit down. And he said something like this first day. He said, if you're really serious about understanding Chinese strategy, you have to learn to play Weiqi. Go, right? And without it, you're never going to understand Weiqi. And so I started playing, and I became an avid student. I'm not sure I'm a very good player. I'm certainly, not an expert, but I'm a proficient player. I could beat most Westerners pretty easily, and I can even beat some Chinese who've been, playing for less time. So, I mean, one thing I noticed about good players, because I spent more time getting beat than actually, winning. Here's what happens on a Go board. You start to get into you set out a couple stones, and then you get into like a battle, and you're in that battle, and then next thing you know, when your opponent realizes they've kind of got you in a good position, then they start going somewhere else, and now you're in a new battle, and you're always following them as they're putting new stones in parts of the board that you were ignoring, and now you can't ignore it. I mean, when I originally heard about Africa, and this was like in the early 1990s, every single country in Africa had at least one student from at Peking University who was on a full ride scholarship, and they were all doing interesting work. They were 4-year, sometimes 8-year students, and these guys spoke great Chinese. And this is back when China was really poor, right? So I thought that was really interesting. And then later I started noticing these Africa congresses that that China would hold, bring in every African leader, and I lived part of that time right on the second ring road at the corner of Zhengum and Waijia and then Erhuan, and I noticed like there would be like these these processions of limousines going one by one, and you see there was like a huge billboard right in front of my house, and I was always like, wow, what is going on here? This was like 1993, 1994, and then they had another one every few years. My point is, now it's Central Asia, and then and between Africa and Central Asia, it was the Gulf states, and now now China's just built a $3.5 billion port in Peru, and it's building rail and highway all through Latin America. U.S. has had a lot of time to do all of this stuff, and it chose not to. We're playing Weiqi, and China's going to new parts of the board every day, and they're plopping something down. But you can't do that unless you actually have strategy and actually have a strong position. That's when you know somebody's a better player than you. It's when they're able to take a piece of the board and then go to a new piece of the board. And that's all I think about whenever I think of China doing this, is that they're playing such a good strategy game that they're able to just, I think we'll go to Kazakhstan now. And that's what I heard about. I couldn't help but think that, we got to learn to play Weiqi. Like the West is going to have to learn to play. West is going to have to really shore up its strength. And then it's going to have to learn to play Weiqi. It can't just learn to play Weiqi, because you'll just play bad Weiqi if you play right now, because the position that the U.S. and the EU have gotten themselves into, allowing deindustrialization and supply chains, and then a loss of control over critical technologies. Like it's gotten to the point now where China's just plopping stones all over the board, and it's like as an American who knows what's going on, knowing that in America we still think we're playing chess with China because we want to, because every other country thought they were playing chess with us, and so we decided we can decide what game we're playing. I don't know how long it's going to take. At some point, Washington will realize that we need to learn to play Weiqi, because we think we're playing chess and they're playing Weiqi, and we're getting dunked on constantly. And Kazakhstan is, and then the Changsha Agreement is just two more examples of that.
Right. Arnaud, give me your thought. I think you had a very interesting article on Substack where you really felt this was, potentially one of the biggest deals that China has signed, and could have some very big global ramifications. Give us your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, so I think China's investment in Africa goes way back. I was reading the other day the anecdotes of U.S. diplomats who wanted to do a deal with a specific African country, and in the embassy, no one was speaking the local language, so he brought a French translator, because this was one of the African countries colonized by my country, unfortunately. And so that's how he communicated with his hosts. But then a Chinese delegation came, and the Chinese diplomats didn't speak French with the locals, but they were speaking like the local tribal dialect, and that's what China has done. Like in its diplomatic, there is a very famous school for diplomacy, which is actually even harder to get in than Tsinghua or Beta, where they teach literally all the local African dialects. And in order to be a Chinese diplomat posted in those countries, you need to learn the local language and speak it perfectly. And that's been the case for many years. And also every year for also decades, I think, it is a tradition of Chinese diplomacy to start the year by a visit to a different African country. So Wang Yi, the foreign minister, has been doing that forever, since he started his tenure, and I think his predecessor was doing that as well. So it's been a very long-term investment, and this declaration in Changsha is pretty extraordinary language if you read it. So first of all, there is an agreement to set up a huge free trade zone between the whole of Africa and China. So China has committed to charge zero tariff on 100% of the products between China and 53 African countries out of 54. The only African country that's left out is Eswatini, because they have relationship with the Republic of China and not the People's Republic of China. But that's virtually the whole of Africa. Eswatini is very small, just 1 million people. And the most extraordinary part is not the economic part, is more the political language. So in the declaration, the 53 African countries formally commit to implementing China's 3 signature global initiatives, so the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative, as well as to promote the BRI. So effectively, this is the entire African commitment, African continent, supporting China's plan initiatives to reshape global governance, which is quite incredible when you think about it. So I think it is a very important declaration. And it is a testament to China's long-term investment in Africa. That's basically paying off. Africa is putting its future together with China.
It definitely is. I definitely see that as well, and I think that is this new multipolar world that we do live in. The fact that countries around the world have more than one option. They can trade with the U.S., they can trade with China. Certainly, in most countries' best interest to maintain a good relationship with both countries. Zichen, do you think that this is going to be a continuous theme that we see from China? Trying to get more of these trade deals. I mean, and really, being the leader of what we call the global South, or a better term might be the global majority. What is your thoughts of that? As we look into the future.
Yeah, I think this discussion is really helpful because so many things are happening, and especially with the war going on, we tend to forget the 100% tariff exemption for the 53 African countries' exports to China, and the contrast couldn't be clearer enough. In fact, I don't even know people have the time to remember this. Is President Trump actually banned the entry of quite some African countries' citizens into the United States? So it's not just actively neglecting Africa. It's damaging U.S. credibility and image and power and influence in Africa. When I look at the names of those countries, one of them is Republic of Congo. And Republic of Congo is perhaps the world's largest producer of copper, of cobalt, the material that's the most important in making batteries, which is going to be essential for the world energy transition. Now, you don't want to have citizens from that country visit the United States. Now, imagine, will that country where citizens want to work with the United States? Now, how about the energy transition? And the U.S. has been talking about, for quite some time about, containing Chinese influence in these far corners. And now you are banning citizens. I'm sure the U.S. has reasons, maybe a disproportionate percentage of its citizens overstay their visa in the United States, and that could be concern for U.S. national security. But come on, the ban of the entry is a drastically disproportionate thing, and this such a big news. It just gets lost because there are so many things coming out of Washington, D.C. And I think the Chinese emphasis and commitment to Africa, and by extension, to the global majority, which is a wonderful world, and it's long established. For example, every year, the Chinese foreign minister starts his year with a visit to the African continent. You can check; it's on the record. The Chinese foreign minister really goes to Africa very often. And check about the foreign visits of senior U.S. officials. I think President Joe Biden visited Africa once nearing the end of his term. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure maybe President Trump will never visit Africa during his term. So, from the Chinese point of view, it has always been felt when China was much weaker that, it is one of the countries which used to be colonized, which used to be invaded, which used to be, bullied, just as the African countries were, and the African countries played a vital role in, voting for the People's Republic of China to retake the seat at the United Nations. So I think although the Chinese economy has grown a lot, the Chinese technology and science seem to be, far ahead than most of the countries in the African continent. But the Chinese don't look at Africans with they treat them as equals, as fellow human beings who still deserve a chance with finance, with investment. And I remember a recent visit, I think actually last month, I was visiting the United Nations headquarters in New York with my colleagues from the Center for China and Globalization, a leading non-governmental think tank in Beijing. We met with a undersecretary of the United Nations. And he asked us, he is still in charge of artificial intelligence. He gave us a number, and forgive me, I forgot the number. That's the number of AI chips across the entire African continent. It's like several orders less than Meta or Google, a single American company, or maybe a single Chinese company. There are hundreds of millions of residents in Africa, and they also will need to use AI. And if you ask U.S. diplomats and people working on the African cause in the United States, they can't wait to tell you how difficult it is to have some time to meet with U.S. officials to actually talk about Africa. And I think the latest reorganization of the State Department actually shrinks the U.S. diplomatic core, diplomatic resources when it comes to Africa. So, I think when it comes to the respect, the devotion for the global majority, I think the U.S. and China are not at the same level.
Absolutely. Well, I think I want to talk about two quick things here. It's interesting when you have the United States Africa Summit that is always held in Washington, D.C. You have these African leaders that all have to fly to D.C. to attend that. And on the flip side, when China hosts it, they actually go back and forth. So one year they'll host it in China, the next year they'll host it in Africa. You'll have, for example, Xi Jinping will personally go to Africa to attend the summit. So you see just a simple measure of giving face in that regard, right? China's giving face to these African leaders saying, look, we're going to come to your continent. We're going to talk with you. Meanwhile, a lot of African leaders, unfortunately, they say after going to the U.S. that, there wasn't a lot of substance there. There wasn't really much of an announcement. It was more almost a media show, and we didn't really get any tangible deals, much like that. That's what we've seen with the Belt and Road, right? We've seen why that's been so successful is because when China comes in, you have something tangible, right? It's a new hospital or road or port or metro system, something along those lines. I think and the other point I wanted to make is I think a lot of people often try to rebuttal and say, well, who cares? It's Africa, big deal. But Africa is the fastest growing continent on the world, unbelievable amount of resources there. You look at a country like Nigeria, by 2100, it'll be the fourth largest, country in terms of population. They close to 500 million.
People don't realize the size of Africa. Africa is North America plus South America plus Europe. The three of them combined, it's massive.
It's massive, yeah. The actual globe and the map that we traditionally see, it doesn't do Africa justice on how large that land territory is, and again how much potential there is. So I think there's strength in numbers. I think that China is in a good position as this de facto leader of the the global majority, that we call the global South. Gentlemen, we've had an amazing stream tonight. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go around one more time. I'm going to let anybody say some closing thoughts. We'll try to keep it around a minute each, and we're going to wrap up tonight's show. But I want to say thank you to our amazing supporters that were in this channel. Nice vibes. I was trying to type as we were talking tonight, to people chatting here on the stream. Mitch, let us know your closing thoughts here on what you're looking forward to in the future here in regards to China and the world.
Thanks. Well, it was great to see you guys. Always fun to talk, and thanks for organizing, Cy. I think that my closing thought is this. I think that this is the whole world is in a transition. Everything we're seeing, first of all, just the fact that there's multiple conflict points now in the world, and multipolar power, is starting to exercise in different ways. I think, I keep thinking of Mao's, famous quote, "Nongsun Baowei Chengshi," the countryside surrounds the cities, when he was asked how was the Communist Party going to take over China from the caves of Yan'an after the Long March. And the truth is that China is not managing by crisis. They're not managing by headlines. They're managing by strategy. I think that the U.S. is going to have a hard time to replicate that, because we run by crisis and by headlines, and that's because that's what gets a lot of this in the U.S. it's political theater. It reminds me a lot of the gladiators games, right, where you give the bread and circus to the people, and they need that because there's a lot of stress. People in the US are under a lot of stress. I don't think that's clearly understood, but it underlies the fentanyl crisis. It underlies the fact that there's a great polarization happening in politics in the US. It underlies the fact that the US has become a lot less genteel in its dealings with other places. The treatment of countries. The U.S. has had a lot of time to do things in Africa and Latin America and the Gulf states, and there's where we are. We're at this point now. So I think it's net positive for the U.S. Believe it or not, I think everything that's happening, once this new world comes into focus, and once we get through some of the settling of the rubble of all of this, I think we're going to get to a place that looks much more stable and looks much more practical. Which is where the U.S. had to go, and it'll actually hopefully lead to some good outcomes. But in the meanwhile, buckle up, man. Prepare for all eventualities, because that's where we're at.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Mitch. Thank you so much for your insights tonight. Arnaud, I'll pass it over to you. Final thoughts.
Yeah, closing thoughts. So I just want to come back to this Africa story, because to me it's also very illustrative of actually what Mitch was just speaking about. I think to me it's a huge story. It's the whole continent of Africa, declaring sort of its that it shares China's vision of the world, and absolutely no one spoke about that in Western media. Which is crazy. So there is this tendency to, which I think is actually very detrimental to the US and to the West in general, that its own media ecosystem is so powerful that it dictates the narrative, but actually what you end up doing is focusing on things that do matter, but you don't focus on things that might also be extremely, extremely consequential. On same thing when it comes to China, something that I say all the time is that what people don't understand is that all the US propaganda on China is actually, to me, hurts the US more than it hurts China, because it leads to an understanding of the country that is so detached from reality that your actions based on that, mirage that you have of China are, not effective, because you do it based on delusions, on not on truth. So that's why it's so important to have this sort of podcast where we try at a very modest scale to speak about other stories and to give a more I guess, accurate picture of China.
No, absolutely. I think you hit the nail right on the head, Arnaud, and it is always very telling when it's very hard to find these stories in Western media, right? Oftentimes much overlooked, and of course we're distracted right now, right? I mean, the dominant headlines, of course, is Israel, Iran. What is Donald Trump going to do? We're seeing even interviews like with Tucker Carlson interviewing Ted Cruz. These clips start passing on social media, and they really dominate the headlines. And so I think a lot of these events really go under the radar. And again, I think China has this mentality of just slow and steady, just keep moving forward every single day, right? Show up to work, start making deals. We're going to do our business very quietly. We don't need a big hoopla. Yes, Xi Jinping's in Kazakhstan signing a new deal. Yes, just a couple of weeks ago, they're in Changsha signing a deal with Africa. That's just China doing business. And that's, I think, what they're really all about. Zichen, give me your closing comments here and what you're looking forward to in the future here for China.
Well, a few years ago, I think the Chinese were popularizing the term, these are changes unseen in the century. And I think many people outside China were quite suspicious of the characterization. But, as one crisis after another emerges, the statement seems truer and truer by the day. I think overall, the Chinese strategy is still, despite all the turbulences, is to manage its own affairs well. And I mean, it's also true, despite all these, seemingly China China can just do nothing and taking geopolitical victories because the US keeps making mistakes. But at the same time, I think domestically, the Chinese are also facing significant, especially, economic challenges. The growth is not as robust as it used to be. It has all these wonderful shining cities, great infrastructure. DeepSeek is a near peer to OpenAI's ChatGPT. The Chinese EVs are now, I think, without any doubt, the leading cars in the world. China's solar panels are helping, transition, energy transition for even poorer countries because they can now afford, cheaper new energy. But still, the PPI in China is in negative territory for 32 months now, and the CPI is not doing very well. The spending, the domestic consumption is still not up to some of the items. When it comes to domestic spending, it's not back to the pre-pandemic levels. I think for the Chinese economy, for China as a rising global power, the focus is to manage its domestic affairs well, to balance its economy, to find more growth engines, to take care of its own citizens, to provide better lives for its huge 1.4 billion citizens. That's the ultimate aim. All these, international moves are just a secondary goal to facilitate a domestic development plan. And I would hope that, this is also something that the United States maybe can not maybe learn from, but take as some sort of reference instead of externalizing its domestic challenges. Because I've just spent a year in the U.S., I do think that there are significant room for domestic investment, for investment in infrastructure, in its manufacturing, and in its people. In terms of social welfare, there are still many things that can be done in the United States domestically if it can, get over its political, long-term political struggles and institutional obstacles. And in these processes between these two countries, and also, all the facing these challenges across the world, actually by working together, it's going to be easier for everyone. And thank you, Mitch, Arnold, and especially Cyrus for hosting us again and for organizing this chat.
You know what, gentlemen? It's been my pleasure to spend time with us here on YouTube, and thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you for the comments in the chat. And gentlemen, I want to thank you for your time, and we're going to make sure that we continue to do this to keep everybody up to date on the latest in China and geopolitics around the world. I'm Cyrus, the host, and I want to thank you all for being here. And we're going to just do a quick little outro video here, but thank you all for spending time with us, and we'll see you guys in our next episode soon.
See you soon.
All right.
Thank you, Cyrus.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Cyrus.
everybody. All right. Take care, guys.